Good morning to everyone. We begin this morning in Matthew, the 5th chapter. That's pretty much where we left off on Wednesday night. And we had just gotten into chapter 5 a little bit. Chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, as we said on Wednesday night, is collectively known as the Sermon on the Mount. And if you want to take chapter 5 and look at it a little bit closer, you could say it talks about the heart of a believer. This sounds really loud and echoey, does it? Hey, Andy, can we tweak it a little bit? Chapter 6 deals with living for God. And then chapter 7 talks about working to live with God eternally. You're about the fourth or fifth person now to look at that thermostat. Anything more, we're going to call it HVAC people. You lowered it? Okay, so we're going to go from rotisserie chickens to refrigerated chickens. Yeah, Mike will be happy. That's all that matters, as long as Mike is happy. So we said the Sermon on the Mount, these three chapters together, these three chapters discuss two main ideas: who we are on the inside and our relationships. And we talked about the difference in the approach to this, because I've sadly heard this before, and maybe you have too, that we only need to focus on what's inside, and we don't need to focus on other people. And you know, when Jesus gave that great commission that we call it in Matthew the 28th chapter, you know, there's two different messages up on the screen. There's one in gold and one in blue. And, you know, we asked to decide, which one did Jesus go with? Did he go with the one that said, go where you're comfortable, go to the people that look like you, talk like you, think like you, teach them your version of the Bible, baptize only the ones you think are worthy? Or did he say, go make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all that I commanded you? And we agreed he went with the second one. But when we do that, we have to understand it automatically means our relationships matter. Our relationships to other people are absolutely critical to fulfill the commands of Jesus. And then I think this is actually where we landed here, because at the end, you know, it would be really easy for Jesus to say, my relationship to those people isn't good. Those humans, though I created them, just aren't good enough for me. And so I'm not going to mess with them any longer, nor help them or forgive them or do anything for them ever again. Does that sound like something Jesus would say? No. But how often does it sound like something we might say about other people? And so we sometimes think about this as, you know, I'm good, I'm baptized, I'm a believer, and so I'm good. We have to consider other people, because Jesus considered us. He came here and he has not given up on us. And no matter what we have done to him as human beings, he is still with us, forgiving us, loving us, supporting us. We put him on a cross, and yet he still loves us. And so we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about our relationship to other people and our work on behalf of God. We get into chapter 5 and we talk about the heart of a believer. In the first part of chapter 5, you might call it the model believer. Verses 1 through 12 are well known. Those are the Beatitudes. And That's where you're seeing the characteristics of believers. And then verses 13 through 16, Jesus talks about the influence of believers. And 17 through 20, Christ talks about him fulfilling the law, and the true believers are going to obey that law. They're going to obey his law. So as we get started into verses 1 through 11, 1 through 12, we call them the Beatitudes. And that word Beatitudes comes from the Latin word beatitudo, which comes from the Greek word makarios, meaning happy, fortunate, and blessed. Jesus used this word makarios 9 times in 12 verses. And he used it to describe the righteous man, the person who is doing the will of the Father. And in each case, it is followed by a characteristic of the person demonstrating that concept along with a promise. Matthew gives us 9 of these in Matthew 5, verses 1 through 11, 1 through 12. I think it's 1 through 12, isn't it? I may have just found my first typo of the morning. 7 of these 9 focus on a person's character. Verses 1 through 6 focus on our attitudes between ourselves and God. And then verses 7 through 9 focus on our attitude towards other people. And then at the end, verses 10 through 12 concern persecution. And that's something I think we struggle to relate with, because I don't see any of us struggling in that regard. So as we get started, let's jump into Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 12. How's it? Is that showing up okay? In Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." So as we get started with these Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. Who are the poor in spirit? The humble, okay? That would be humble. Yeah. Okay. Okay. There it is. This person, the poor in spirit, they are humble, but they recognize their position in relation to God, and they realize how great God is versus how lowly we are as human beings, as the created. And it reminds me of this, what's called a fisherman's prayer, or the Breton fisherman's prayer. It says, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." We are so small in comparison to God. And the poor in spirit recognize that. They recognize how minuscule we are in comparison to the Creator. And I think that brings about the humility. I think it brings about the things that we are about to see. Because what you notice here, and I'm just going to go on and share it with you, is when you look at what Jesus says here in chapter 5 and the Beatitudes build off of each other. But the whole sermon, 5, 6, and 7, chapters 5, 6, and 7, it is one sermon. It's not 3 chapters, we ought to just take out the chapter divisions and just leave it as one sermon. And when we do that, we realize it is one train of thought from Jesus about who we should be as people, who we should be in relationship to God, who we should be in relationship to others. And so the whole sermon, 5, 6, and 7, is going to build off of itself. What he talks about early on here, we're going to see the same ideas coming back in later parts of chapter 5, into 6, into 7. So, yeah, it does require somebody to be humble when they are poor in spirit, but humility is coming in and of itself here in just a couple verses. It says in verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." These are the ones who understand they have sinned. They're not perfect like God. They're not whole without God. But notice the promise that Jesus has there. They shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. You know, we've all met people who are brash, they're arrogant, they run around, they've always got an answer. Doesn't matter what it is, they've got not just an answer, they have the answer. And and they know they have the answer. They want you to know they have the answer. And at the end of the day, they want you to recognize that they have the answer. They want you to recognize they are the smartest person in the room. And that is anything but being gentle. Because 9 times out of 10, that type of person comes down like a sledgehammer. And when we talk about blessed are the gentle, we're talking about being meek. We're talking about being humble, having humility. This person realizes how great God is, as we talked about in verse 1, and they recognize they don't have anything to bring to the table except themselves, because they are imperfect and they have sinned. They are the created. And so when they understand verses 3 and 4, then we can be gentle and meek and humble in verse 5. Verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." You know, he uses the comparison, the analogy of being hungry and thirsting, and comparing it to reading and being filled with this right here. And when we're hungry and we're thirsty, what do? We search for food. We go after it. And the ones who are truly hungry and thirsty for righteousness, they shall be satisfied. And it's not just because of this right here, it's because God provides it. God provides it. And when they're waiting on the Lord to answer a prayer, that takes patience. But it also builds faith and endurance. And prayers are answered. And they will be satisfied. So verses 3 through 6, that's our relationship to God. And then when we start looking at verses 7, 8, and 9, we start looking at our relationship to other people. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And mercy involves gentleness. Mercy involves gentleness not just with the people we like, but also the people that have done us wrong. The people who who can't help us in any way, shape, or form. Mercy is kindness and help and forgiveness towards others when they do not deserve it from us. Would you all agree with that? The person who cuts us off on the other side of the road as we're driving down the road. And I'm horrible about this. And I'm trying to get better about it. And just wave them by. Or just not wave at all, because nowadays they might see a wave and think it's something else. And so you just let it go. And instead of getting mad and angry and reacting, show humility, show mercy, let it go. Somebody does you wrong, can you let it go? Can you give them and extend to them the forgiveness and that they may not realize they need, they may not want. But for your own personal spirituality and well-being, can you extend that forgiveness? And just let it go. There you go. And that's the thing. When you look at Jesus, when people notice the thief on the cross, when he's talking to Jesus, Jesus didn't say, "Hey, I'm sorry, you're already up on the cross. It's too late for you, pal." Jesus showed mercy even at that last hour, and it was automatic to that thief on the cross. That's how we should be towards other people. Blessed are the pure in heart, verse 8, for they shall see God. This is probably one of the most pointed statements I think he makes in this area, because this gets to the heart of what motivates us. It's not hard to figure out. He says, who are the pure in heart. This is the person who has sincere and pure motives, as well as sincere and pure thoughts in their heart and mind. Miss Donna. Absolutely. If you couldn't hear Miss Donna, she said that Jesus also would use the illustration of being like little children who are innocent and pure in heart, and that we should be like them. And, when we talk about being pure in heart, it is utterly sincere. There's no motive other than to be like God. And we're going to come back to verse 8 as we get on into the Sermon on the Mount, because he's going to start talking to them very soon in this sermon about not being a hypocrite. Well, what's a hypocrite have to do with being pure in heart? Can't I just do this in public and have purity of my heart? Can I get up here and preach a sermon or lead songs and still have purity of heart? What's he talking about? And so that's where he's going to build off of this as he goes through this sermon, because he wants his followers to be utterly sincere in their devotion and their service to others and their service to God. In verse 9, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." This I think builds off of verse 7 personally, I think, for me, as well as verse 8, because when it talks about peacemaker, that's going to be somebody who is humble, who is seeking after God, but it's also someone who is merciful. Someone does something to you, what is your reaction? Is it to seek peace, or is it to maybe seek our version of justice? And, you'll see all these incidences where people are saying, well, if this happens to me, here's how I'll handle And usually it's not a very peaceful way of handling it. Yes, sir. Mhm. Absolutely. If you didn't hear Mike, he shared several thoughts, but um, the one that hits, I think, globally is that these attributes are not to be confined. One person gets one attribute, one person gets another. All of these attributes should be in every single one of Christ's followers. And so, you know, I will give you this example. And our daughters got into an issue last week, last Friday. I was not a very peaceful person last Friday night. So they have a number of consequences, we'll call it that. And honestly, one of their consequences is to come here to Matthew, the 5th chapter, and verses 1 through 12, read it, break it down, to use the Bible dictionary that we have in our office at home to look up any words they don't understand, and then to identify the parts that they need the most work on. Now, Layla was not just a little at fault. Layla was very at fault. Well, so was Jenna, but Layla has extenuating circumstances. She is having to write a paper over this. That's what happens when you have two teachers for parents. They get a term paper, and it's one page, single space typed. So they both have to be taught. All of us have to be taught. All of us have to be reminded that these are all within each of us, not just part of us, part of it in some of us. We get into Matthew the 5th chapter, verses 13 through 16. Here, Jesus transitions a little bit away from the characteristics of believers and talking about the influence of believers. Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay. And he's not willing and asking us to do something that he didn't do himself. So going to 13 through 16, he talks about the influence of his believers. He talks about being the salt of the earth. And then he talks about being the light of the world. And very quickly, we know that salt has been used for centuries for various reasons, all to improve the situation. You know, if you got something that doesn't taste well, add salt to it. You know, you can add salt or ketchup for us, but, you know, add salt to it. It'll help. If you're trying to preserve food, they use salt for that. When there's healing to be done, salt is often part of that process there. So it's always meant to improve the situation of a person. But then he also uses light twice here in verses 14 through 16 as a metaphor for how we should live. He uses light from a city high up on a hill, and then he uses light from a lamp set somewhere within a house. Either place, the idea that Jesus is expressing with the light is to be helpful to others, to share with others, to contribute to the benefit of others. You know, my goodness, it's been almost 20 years. When I worked at Logan County years ago, I was a basketball coach as well, and I would get home. I'd get back to school from an away game at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, and have to drive all the way back to Bowling Green. And you know, if you hit it just on the right nights where it's a pretty clear sky, you can see the light from Bowling Green all the way down 6880 at Logan County High School. That's how bright the city of Bowling Green is off in the distance. And you know, that's the idea that he is sharing here. Be the light that shines so bright people can't miss you. Share that light with others. Help others. Be the salt, be the light that helps other people. And then you know, the same issue, or the use of light inside the house. You know, when the power goes out, we don't put a lamp down here on the floor. We set it high up on a shelf or on a table so it illuminates more of the room. The influence we have matters. How we use that influence matters. He has just talked to us about the characteristics we are all supposed to have. And so if we take those characteristics and we dial them up so that we are serving God fully and faithfully, that light is going to shine out and people are going to see it. Now, change that around to if we do the exact opposite of the Beatitudes, what kind of light that gives off? What kind of example that gives off to other people? Miss Donna. Absolutely. Absolutely. And 17 through 20, Jesus talks about being the fulfillment of the law. He's talked about, here's the characteristics of believers, of godly believers. And then he said, here's the influence that you have as believers, but here is the law. I didn't come to destroy it, I came to fulfill it. And that's a unique situation here, because you could do away with something simply because you trash it and throw it away. Or you can fulfill it and make it complete. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He says, don't think I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill, to complete it. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Nothing's fading away, not one stroke or letters being done away with until it's all completed, until it's all accomplished. And then he talks about, and it brings it into that influence here, verse 19. Whoever then annuls one of these, the least of these commandments, and teaches others to do the same, shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Going back to that influence of his followers. What kind of influence are we using? Are we teaching someone to do less than what was commanded? Or are we teaching them exactly what we are supposed to teach them? And then verse 20, for I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And he's bringing in here a comparison to the religious leaders of the day who, and he's kind of being blunt here. He's saying, don't be like these people, because everything that I've just talked about, everything I've just listed, they aren't. And he says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you have to be better than them. You have to do different than what you have historically been taught and seen in your communities and in your synagogues. You have to do better. You have to do this instead. And I know we're moving quick. We've got chapters 5, 6, and 7 to keep us on schedule, or Dad's going to have to make up a lot of ground on next Sunday. So, trying to keep Dad happy. In Matthew 5, verses 21 through 48, he is going to talk about the value of the heart. And this is so important. So incredibly important. Because Jesus places great value on what we feel and what's inside of us. He uses the extreme act of murder here in verses 21 through 26 to not just discuss the act of murder, but the feelings and the ideas that would lead a person to commit such a violent act against another person. And when we read those verses, he's talking about the depth and the contrast here that a Christian should have, someone should have, between being humble and gentle and kind versus somebody who is going to act in such a way as to commit murder, and the level of anger that person has to have in order to go that direction. And it's the Jews of that day and time were very good at playing semantics. And so, it's we ask the question, who's my neighbor? Who's my brother? Well, Jesus, we read in other places, was clear about who your brother is and who your neighbor is. So this applies to everyone that we meet. It's not just to some people, it's to all people. And when we look at not committing murder, that it starts with anger. It starts with frustration. It starts with pain and hurt inside the heart. Because he says, and yes, I've hit the ripe old age where I'm using reading glasses for my Bible. So this is new for me. I feel like Mike. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the courts. Anger is one of those things that it can eat at us. It can plague us. It can drag us down into the depths of our memories and our feelings. Everything that we just talked about, that Jesus said about being merciful and kind and forgiving, anger won't let you do those things. Anger brings up those things over and over and over again. Anger is what leads to division. Anger is what leads to even greater pain and greater sorrow than what we would have felt had we just been willing to be peacemakers, to be merciful, to be meek and humble. Yes, ma'am. And I would agree with you. You know, entitlement can be a problem that leads to anger and an excuse for even greater anger. Um, you know, feeling like you deserve to be to feel a certain way or to do a certain thing is can really lead us to some bad places. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're told in the scriptures, be angry and do not sin. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And you know, that's the value of the heart. Is it is not just sin to go and do something. It is sin to think it, to feel it. And that's the whole route that he is going through right through here in 21 through 48 is whether we're talking about murder, whether we're talking about adultery or taking oaths, retaliate, it's all about, it's not just about what you do, it's about how you feel about it in your heart. And, you know, when we go to talking about adultery and divorce and taking oaths, I don't think anybody in this building would disagree that marriage is sacred and it is binding. And Jesus forbids false oaths and vows. And that leads to the value, talking about the value of your word and your name. When you give your word or you make that promise to someone about something minor, you keep it. But then apply that to, and in verse 37, he talks about let your yes be yes and your no be no. Apply that to your marriage. Apply this to those vows that you took before a bunch of witnesses and before God, where you said, I will take this person. They are going to be my spouse in sickness and in health, richer and poorer, till death do us part. The only person I'm ever going to commit myself to. That was the vow that so many of us made to our spouses. And if we deviate, if we move away from that vow, if we move away from those commitments and our relationship to our spouse, one bit, whether physically or in our heart, then that is sin. That is sin. That's the value of the heart. Because the physical aspect, doesn't just happen spontaneously. It happens first right here in the heart. Yeah. In the brain. Yes. We call that remorse, don't we? You know, that comes from being humble, and it comes from being poor in spirit and recognizing all those attributes that, yeah, we can be angry that I messed up again. I'm struggling with this. I messed up on it again. And it's what we do after that really matters, right? Hey, we got 3 minutes. I heard a zipper on a Bible case. Verses 38 through 42 talks about retaliation. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other on him also. Really? How many of you are going to get slapped on one cheek and then turn the other? That's how hard that is. That's how hard that is. We're not talking about somebody who is just not being nice to you. He's using the extreme here of somebody hitting you. Turn the other cheek. Forgive. Move on. And he says, talks about love your enemies. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy is what they had been taught from old. But he says, love your enemies. Pray for them who persecute you. That is hard. How many of us have prayed for our enemies lately? Prayed for the people that have it out for us? Yeah. We don't want to do that. Everything Jesus has been teaching in these 48 verses is everything that the world disagrees with. Everything about it is what the world disagrees with. And when you go back to verses 11 and 12 of chapter 5, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He's telling them that at the outset because he knows that it's going to happen. And why will the persecution happen? Because the world sees his followers differently. The world sees Christians as different. And if we aren't looked at as different from the rest of the world, then we're doing something wrong. And so that's why he's gone through and laid out, here are the characteristics of my believers. Here's how we use our influence. Here's the value of the heart. Yeah. Yeah. Guys, thank you all for a wonderful class this morning.